Moin Leute, Harry wieder am Start. Today we're gonna talk about a really controversial topic. I know, I'm a controversial guy. I have some controversial opinions, but today's video will blow your mind. I'm sure you guys all know this Pokemon Incineroar. Yes, it is pretty common knowledge that this Pokemon is broken as fuck. Ever since its release in 2018, or I should say, ever since its hidden ability got released, it has been dominating online battles ever since. If you look at Series 12, for example, why isn't this working? Um, yeah. If you look at Series 12, for example, Incineroar got over 73.76% usage, even more than Zacian, by most people considered to be the most broken Pokemon ever. However, is Incineroar actually broken? I mean, it's a stupid question, isn't it? Of course Incineroar is broken. It's on every team. Everyone uses it. It wins every tournament ever. I mean, it won Worlds like twice or three times already. I don't even know, bro. Incineroar, insane, but actually don't think it's broken. Crazy. Crazy. So, what the fuck? Stop. Stop right here, bro. What are you doing? What is this video? But I thought Incineroar is broken as fuck. Well, I thought so too. I mean, I still think Incineroar is kinda broken, but that's probably just my bias speaking. I actually did what any normal person would do. And I looked at all the data available on Picalytics in order to prove that Incineroar is actually not broken. Because I thought Incineroar is broken. And Incineroar were truly broken, there would be no way to disprove it, and prove that Incineroar is actually not broken. But by trying to prove that Incineroar actually is broken, I accidentally proved the opposite. Bro, I feel like a flat earthler right now, bro. So, what did I do to come to this conclusion, this opinion, so extreme? The world has changed forever. We may never. Guys, right now, look outside. Look at the things around you. These things, you will not see them in the same way as you did before. Because the world we know it right now won't be the same after you guys watch this video. So, what did I do to figure out that the cinema is actually not broken? I put on my hoodie and my epic sunglasses and I went full hacker mode. Let's go! I am done. I made a huge Excel sheet, which I will link in the description, which proves that Incineroar is in fact not broken. So, I thought, just like you guys, just like you fools, you buffoons, no, just kidding, that Incineroar is absolutely broken. Of course I believe this, so I tried to prove it. And I failed. Which is why, clearly, Incineroar is not broken. Right? I mean, that's how it should work, right? So, the thesis that I had is that Incineroar is broken, but what is a broken Pokemon, Obviously, many of you do know this, but we have to be clear about this when we analyze this, because otherwise we can just prove whatever and say, oh yeah, it's broken. So, There's an interview with the audio council member. Sorry, not member. He's actually the head of the whole thing, I think. I don't know. Finchinator. And he basically said broken Pokemon are Pokemon that are restricting in team building and that are also centralizing. So what is centralizing? It's basically if the whole format is built around a Pokemon. And what does restricting in team building mean? Well, basically you are forced to use certain Pokemon or you can't use certain Pokemon because of another Pokemon. Again, the whole video with the interview is gonna be linked in the description. Check it out definitely. Finch also got a YouTube channel, so check that one out as well. But basically, the example that he used was Dracovish, right? Dracovish was broken and was banned in the singles format by Smorgon and the OU Council because in order to beat Dracovish, you had to use certain Pokemon. For example, Seismitoad, which ended up being the most used Pokemon at the time. So basically, why this proves that it is broken is basically you have a Pokemon and you have to counter it. So you have to use a very select few amount of Pokemon, for example, Ferrothorn or Seismitoad, in order to beat it. So basically, your team has to be built around a certain broken Pokemon, even though that is not even the number one most used Pokemon, which is crazy, right? So yeah, that was the example he gave. So how do we actually quantify this? Because obviously the whole thing is super subjective, which there's nothing wrong with doing it the way they do. But I wanted to figure this out in for VGC, which is obviously very different to singles, with facts and data, because obviously it would be interesting if VGC player were able to vote if Incineroar is broken or not, right? Obviously that's not possible, but it would be really interesting. So in order for a Pokemon and specifically Incineroar to be broken, these things would be the case, right? You would have a big difference between the most used Pokemon and the second most used Pokemon, because obviously, as you guys know, Incineroar is the most used Pokemon in every format that it's in, except for 2018, because it wasn't released for like half a format. So it only is the second most used Pokemon. Crazy. So there should be a big difference between the number of usage between the first and second most Pokemon, because it is very centralizing. That's the thesis, right? Also, less Pokemon will be good or viable. Same with the Dracovish example, right? Because Dracovish was a thing, other offensive water types were just not really usable because Dracovish does the job better. And also, you were not able to use certain Pokemon that would lose to Dracovish that are defensive. For example, I don't know, Hippowdon. I mean, I bet some people still use Hippowdon, but you are way better off using Seismitoad as a stealth worker, right? Because, well, that doesn't lose to Dracovish. So less Pokemon will be good or viable. And Incineroar is a little bit of an interesting Pokemon to do this with, because unlike Pokemon like Zacian, which we'll talk about later, Incineroar is more of a support-oriented Pokemon, right? So it doesn't one-shot everything. So if you, it's not as clear that a Pokemon is broken. Again, with the example of Dracovish, Finchinator said something along the lines: if it sleeps more than half of the time, it's gonna be broken. However, with Incineroar, we're not gonna see Incineroar sweeping, unless we're using like weakness policy, but not that is there to sweep, right? So yeah, we will figure out if less Pokemon that use physical attacks will be viable, right? And then last but not least, there are less good Pokemon and good viable Pokemon that have a good matchup into the best Pokemon. First of all, let's clarify for this video, good Pokemon will be Pokemon that have a usage rate above 4.52%, because in standard OU play in singles they would be considered good Pokemon, standard Pokemon. So they would be good in VGC, and also in the viable Pokemon will be Pokemon that have less than 1% usage, because if a Pokemon has less than 1% usage, it's not gonna be viable, because obviously people use good Pokemon in order to win, right? So let's finally get into the data. So those are the usage stats of the first most used Pokemon, of the second most used Pokemon, and of the third most used Pokemon in every format. Oh, apparently I made a mistake right here in the scroll second, who cares? So, as you guys can see, this format right here, the VGC 2019 Moon series, it's actually very centralized, right? Crazy. However, if you compare it with something like Series 5, this is what a non-centralized format looks like, right? So there's gonna be one Pokemon that is really good that people are gonna use more often than other Pokemon, right? So this looks like, oh, Incineroar is definitely broken because in this format it's really good. Well, turns out that on average, that is not absolutely not the case. On average, well, there are obviously gonna be some formats where Incineroar is gonna be more broken, and other Pokemon where Incineroar isn't gonna be as broken. On average, Pokemon formats with Incineroar are gonna be way less centralized and way more balanced, as you guys can see here. Here's the average of the formats without Incineroar. You can see big difference right here between first and second most used Pokemon, and then small difference. And here it is almost like a 45-degree angle, which is crazy. I do have to say real quick, but unfortunately we only have 4 formats where Incineroar isn't allowed in to look at, which is really unfortunate because well, it's just how Pikalytics works, right? And also another side note is I won't look at tournament usage because well, that's not only a shit ton of effort and that would take a lot of time which I don't have. And also there are gonna be certain um, that's not gonna be very representative, right? Because if you have a Pokemon like Pachirisu win the World Championship, for example, that's not representative for the whole format, right? And also another side note, Series 6 is actually not gonna be included because Series 6 is like an edge case, you know, it's like an Ausreißer, as we say in Germany. It's a data point, or in this case, a Pokemon format, which is just so different from every other format that it doesn't make sense to include it because it would just mess up the results, right? I did look at some cases with Series 6 included, and it is not representative of the actual formats with Incineroar, for example, or without Zacian, yada yada yada. So let's just not include Series 6. It was just an experiment by Game Freak. If you don't know what Series 6 is, it's worth a whole other video. Basically, I think 10 or 20 most used Pokemon in both singles and doubles got banned from both singles and doubles. So Magnezone, for example, wasn't legal in VGC, even though nobody used it in VGC. But also, obviously, Incineroar was banned. Unfortunately, Urshifu was allowed, which surprisingly became the number 1 most used Pokemon. Who would have guessed? But basically, you had 6 Pokemon that dominated the usage, and then you had a few Pokemon that are like in the middle, and then like 0 Pokemon after that were actually usable. Yeah, never again. Never again. So, what is with the number of viable Pokemon per format? Because obviously, if we have a Pokemon as broken as Incineroar, we are going to have less Pokemon viable per format. Oh, by the way, feel free to pause the video if you want to look at the statistics in detail, or even better, look at the Excel sheet in the description. I'm just gonna go over this real quickly because most people are not gonna care about the exact percentages and how I arrived at this conclusion, yada yada. But if you wanna find this stuff out in detail, go to the description, find it out. So right here we have a Pokemon that are good with a 4.2% usage, right? And then Pokemon that have an above 1% usage, and then we have Pokemon that are in between, right? So that are just um, between 1 and 4.52%. And there is no difference. As you can see, you can't see anything. Because Incineroar does not change anything about the number of good Pokemon and about the number of viable Pokemon. As you guys can see, there's a difference of like 2 Pokemon. Again, check it out in detail in the Excel sheet, which is not worth talking about really, except for the fact that that's crazy. To me at least, that is crazy. Okay, but what about the Pokemon that are hurt by Intimidate? Surely, surely, when Incineroar is the number 1 most used Pokemon, you would see a big difference in Pokemon that are hurt by physical, that use physical attacks and that don't. However, as you guys can see in this graph, there isn't really a big difference. I mean, I assume this is the case because Pokemon like Arcanine, like Scrafty, like Palderia and Towers are really good intimidators, but just fill the wall of an intimidator. But it is still crazy to me that apparently being intimidated isn't really a good reason to not use a Pokemon. I don't really get it, but I'm just showing you guys the data. Look here, for example, this is the number of Pokemon that have 1% usage, and out of those, not even half of them have a physical move in their moveset. However, in a formats with Incineroar and in formats with and without Incineroar, again, there isn't a difference. Incineroar doesn't make a difference, you know? There are still as many Pokemon that use physical attacks in formats with Incineroar as without Incineroar, which is insane. But then surely there must be Pokemon that lose to Incineroar that are less viable, right? Because obviously, when I wanna use Magikarp and I get intimidated, lights out for me, right? However, as you can see, you can see nothing. Nothing at all. No difference. Doesn't make a difference if Incineroar is in a format or not. It does not make a difference. So guys, it turns out Incineroar is in fact not broken! Guys, if you want to have a format which is not centralized, where loads of Pokemon are good and loads of Pokemon are viable, play a format with Incineroar. I never thought I would say this, but like I said, my world view has been shattered. I have been looking at these facts for the last of these at these graphs and stuff for the last 3 days minimum, and before that, also I did some breaks to do some real science, like I said. But yeah, that is crazy. So maybe my thesis is just ass, you know? Maybe my thesis actually doesn't prove that the Pokemon is actually broken or not. So I look at the Pokemon that is clearly broken, right? Look, if Zacian isn't broken, what is broken, right? I don't know. So Zacian is broken. Was? We're gonna have a high difference, blah blah blah. You guys know the drill, right? So if you compare the average usage of the most used Pokemon for Incineroar, of Zacian, and in total, we can see that Zacian is in fact less central. Who am I joking? Guys, obviously you can see this more than 10% difference. There's a more than 10% difference between, man, English is so difficult. Between the first most used Pokemon, no, sorry, before between the second most used Pokemon and the third most used Pokemon. So basically, like my man Phantom suggested, who told me I should look at Zacian as well, thank you by the way, it is not Incineroar that is broken. We proved that already. However, Zacian plus Incineroar, that is actually broken. Because obviously the first most used Pokemon is most of the time gonna be Incineroar, and actually I think in one format Zacian was the second most used Pokemon, but the point is, anyways, on average the first and second most used Pokemon make a core that is actually centralizing, you know? This core is even more centralizing than this right here, or exactly as centralizing as in a format without Incineroar, which is crazy. We have already proven that Incineroar is actually helping the format be less centralized. So yeah, man, I still can't believe it, but yeah, I'm rambling a bit. So basically, this is obviously broken. Zacian is broken. This is why we see this, right? Next up, we look at the Pokemon that are viable, that match up well into the best Pokemon in the format, right? So, we can actually see that in formats with Zacian, the number goes up. However, Zacian obviously isn't the number one most used Pokemon in any format, actually. And we can see that while the Pokemon that match up into the best Pokemon are roughly the same, if we look at the Pokemon that match up into Zacian, we can see there are more good Pokemon, like one or two more good Pokemon. But then the Pokemon that are viable decreases, right? So basically, well, there are a few good Pokemon that you can use to counter Zacian, but that's it. Right? Again, not Zacian alone. You have to consider a whole team. Doubles is pretty complex, right? So obviously Pokemon like Gastrodon would come to mind, right? Because Gastrodon is really good into Zacian and Incineroar, as well as Kyogre, which obviously Zacian Kyogre was the best combination in Series 12. So again, this graph proves that you have less viable Pokemon. Pokemon that you could have used before to beat Zacian, for example, I don't know, Incineroar, would now be bad if we look at well, Kyogre plus Zacian, right? So again, the number decreases. So again, we can prove that you have to use certain Pokemon in order to beat Zacian. But there's another thing. If you guys actually watched the interview, you would know that one of the things that the OU council member said is actually tier leader, I think. I don't know, who cares? But he said, what Finchinator said, is basically that if you have to use bad Pokemon that wouldn't be good otherwise, in order to beat a certain Pokemon, then certain Pokemon is gonna be broken, right? And this is exactly what we see right here. We use Pokemon that wouldn't be good otherwise in order to beat Zacian. So, if we go back to the thesis that Zacian is broken, we can see that not the usage difference between the first and second most used Pokemon is bigger than usual, but the difference between the second and third most Pokemon is actually bigger than usual, because again, the first two Pokemon are centralizing. It's not just one Pokemon that is centralizing in formats with Zacian, it's actually two Pokemon. Zacian on its own maybe isn't broken, we don't know. Unfortunately, we don't have a format with Zacian but without Incineroar. Or maybe luckily, depending on how you look at things, but yes, Zacian is in fact broken. Less Pokemon will be good or viable. This is about the same. You can see this in the Excel sheet, by the way. I didn't want to include everything into the PowerPoint. And it's the same with physical attacks, it's also about the same. But less good or viable Pokemon will have a good matchup into the best Pokemon. Again, there are more bad Pokemon that now have a good Pokemon into the best Pokemon, but less Pokemon would have a good matchup into Zacian, right? So, in conclusion, we can say that Zacian is in fact broken, but not Incineroar. Oh, I forgot, I have one last graph. Oh yeah, the number of viable Pokemon, again, doesn't really change much, right? So, guys, is your mind blown already? All I can say is, this is why Incineroar is in fact not broken. Guys, use Incineroar. Use it, do it, use Incineroar. It is not centralizing, in fact, it is the total opposite. Right? It helps you use other Pokemon that wouldn't be viable otherwise. I hate to say it, you know? I thought I would be the last one to admit it, but actually Incineroar is not broken. Well, hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys aren't already grabbing your forks and your torches and coming to my house. Not yet, at least. Not yet. Guys, if you want to disagree with me, please, please, please disagree with me. Please, I want to prove that Incineroar is in fact broken. I wasn't able to. So if you guys want to use the Excel sheet, again, it's in the description. Feel free to let me know your opinion. My opinion personally is I really don't like Incineroar. Unfortunately, it is not centralizing like again this graph shows. But I personally like to use Pokemon that are more high risk, right? Incineroar is the perfect Pokemon of low risk, high reward, right? Which is why people use it. They don't use it because it's. I mean, obviously, it's the best Pokemon ever. Don't get me wrong, but um, maybe after Zacian, who cares? But again, it's low risk, high reward, and that's the opposite of my playstyle, which is why I don't like Incineroar. However, like I said, it's not broken. Again, please disagree with me if you have actual good points and data to, you know, look at. Also, let me know what else you guys would want to see. There are some more interesting things. For example, I figured out, I don't know which one of his Excel sheets this is. I think it's this one right here. Figured out that um, the formats that are in Sword and Shield were actually the least centralized. Oh no, wait, it's this one. Are actually the least most centralized. But anyways, this is all topics for another video. If you guys wanna see this, let me know. Well, have a nice day. Haut rein. Ciao.